If you're given a problem with a series of numbers, say -10, -15, -20, and you're asked to find, say, the 18th term, there's a couple different ways you can do this. You could go and start looking at the pattern and recognize that it's losing 5 every single time. And because it's adding and subtracting by a constant amount, we'll call that an arithmetic sequence. And you could say, well, I could just keep subtracting 5, and I could do it a bunch more times until I get to the 18th term. And you could write down every single term number. So this is term number 1, and term number 2, and term number 3. And you could just keep going until you finally get to the 18th term. But let's be honest, it takes a long time. And if this was a bigger term that they were asking for, say the 132nd term, it would be very difficult to do that without making a mistake. So it's really not the best way to handle these kinds of problems. You could do it, but there's a lot of mistakes you can make, and let's be honest, we don't want to waste our time. So there are other ways you could do this as well. And to kind of show you graphically what that would look like, imagine a number line. So you've got a number line, and you start off here at, say, -10. That'll be our first term. And every single time you go down 5 more. So you subtract 5, you end up with the next number in your term, -15. Repeat it again, subtract 5, you end up with the next number in your term, say -20. And this is going to continue going. It's going to happen a bunch more times until finally at the end of the road, you're going to jump that last time, and you're going to end up at some number that we don't know yet. So I'm going to put a little box there and leave it blank. And that will be our 18th term. I'm going to start numbering all the different terms here. I'll call this my first term, this one my second term, this one my third term, and they'll keep going at some rate and eventually end up at 18. Now, if you want to figure this out, what this final number should be, the simplest way to do it is to figure out how far you're going to jump from your beginning. And if I go a total of 8 to the 18th term, I'm going to make a total of 17 jumps, which is a little confusing at first until you remember that if you take 18 and you subtract 1, that's going to be how many jumps you end up needing to make. So in this case, I'm jumping 18 times to get to my 17 times to get to my 18th term. So a total of 17 jumps will get you there. Now, if you want to figure out what the distance is, it's going to take you 17 jumps times a total of -5 each time, because that's how much you're losing. And you'll end up with -85. So, after you drop down a total of 85 from -10, that will end up putting you at your final term. So this is how far you travel from your first term. So, if I'm writing this all down, I'll say -10, subtracting the 85 that I just had, will give me -95. And that one should be my 18th term. It's a good place to start. But if I want to do this for any term that I want, I need to come up with an equation that I can use instead of having to go through the whole process every single time I want to find a new term. I don't want to have to sit there and try to think this all through every single time. Equations make things quicker, which is why I'm going to try to come up with one based on what I've done up here. The general way that you do that is you start with your first number. Which is my -10. And you subtract basically how far you've jumped. or you add it if you're growing, but in this case we're subtracting. How far you've traveled on your number line. And you combine those two things together. So you're going to be adding those two things together. And how far you traveled, if you wanted to take that idea and kind of represent it, you would know that it came from your change or your difference. We'll call it the difference for this situation, but it could also be called your change or your growth. And you multiply that times the number of jumps. So those two numbers together, like you can see up here, combine to form how far you've traveled. So I'll put those kind of in parentheses to remind you that those two things basically become how far you've traveled. Now, if I'm going to write this a little bit more generally, here's how I'll do it. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can see more of the page. Make sure I've given myself enough room to write things down. All right. So there's everything set up the way I need to. Sorry, it's taking so long. If I want to write this down with variables and using numbers, autofocus. It's not autofocusing. There we go. It's a little bit better. If I want to write this using numbers, I'm going to say my first number is going to be, well, I'll call this the series A. So this is where I'm going to start introducing my notation for this. A sub n is going to be the term number that I'm looking for. In this situation, for my 18th term, it would be A sub 18. And my first number, I'm going to call A sub 1, because that is my first number, wherever that is. And to that, I'm going to add my difference, which in this case is going to be -5 for my situation down here. So here, I'll start filling this equation out for my situation. So A1 is my first number, which in this case is going to be -10. And my difference, in this case, was -5. And I'm going to multiply that difference times the number of jumps that I need, which I'm going to change a little bit for the equation, and I'm going to say it's the term number, which is my n, minus 1. So don't forget that n minus 1, that whole thing, is your number of jumps, because that tells you how far you had to jump in your equation. And for this problem, it was 18 minus 1. And then when I do the math a little bit farther, I find that A sub 18 is equal to -10. Oops, let's do that in blue. Sorry about that. -10 plus -5 times my 17. And then doing this one step further, I end up with a 18 is equal to -10 minus 85, which, when you combine those together, ends up being -95. So, that is how you can develop any equation for an arithmetic sequence based on the 3 different parts that you need. The first one is your first number. The second part is the difference that you need, which we've used D. And the third part is the number of jumps that you have.